Australian icon Ita Buttrose has entered the debate about multiculturalism in her new memoir. In strong language, the former Australian of the Year also calls for federal government leadership on the issue of antisemitism, and she expresses dismay about the violent protests that have unfolded on our streets. Ita Buttrose writes in her book, and I'm quoting here, "Multicultural Australia was once a matter of pride, but not any longer. Australia used to be considered one of the best multicultural societies in the world. But following the terror attack on Ripponlea Synagogue in Melbourne in December 2024, federal opposition leader Susan Lee summed up what many Australians were thinking when she said that our once harmonious multicultural nation doesn't feel that way anymore. Our nation is fraying at the edges." And Ita Buttrose writes that the Israel-Hamas war and other Middle East conflicts have resulted in racial and religious divisions and sometimes violent protests in our capital cities. She writes in her memoir, out today, "Most Australians don't have a problem with peaceful protests, but violent protests are not the Australian way and are more likely to alienate people, including supporters." Now, you'll recall the former Prime Ministers, John Howard, Scott Morrison, Tony Abbott, Turnbull, Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, who issued a joint letter urging an end to hate after the October 7 attacks. Well, Ita Buttrose writes of the lack of leadership in the past 2 years. She says, 6 former Australian Prime Ministers showed the kind of leadership missing in Australia in recent times, when in 2023 they urged for an end to religious hatred and letting the Israel-Gaza conflict divide Australians. She says, "I would like to see this message repeated over and over again by all governments, but particularly the federal government." It's an extremely important point. Yet journalists largely ignore her crucial message and instead complain that she hasn't written about the self-promoting pro-Palestinian activist Antoinette Lattouf. They're obsessed with an anti-Israel agitator who was given the flick a couple of days into a 5-day job. This activist doesn't warrant a mention in the grand tale of Ita's life story because it's an irrelevant episode in her extraordinary life and career. Ita Buttrose is a towering figure in Australian journalism and media. Her book, Unapologetically Ita, tells her life story, and she is a trailblazer. She launched Clio magazine in 1972, famously introducing the nude male centrefold. In this interview with the old ABC program, This Day Tonight, from 1975, you can see her editing cover lines.
A bit out of focus?
I think she might be.
Yeah, we'll put another one out. Why can't we ever get them smiling? They always look as though they're going to a bloody funeral.
Launching Clio was a controversial idea at the time. It was high risk for what was considered a conservative Australian market. Ita worked closely with Kerry Packer as they created the magazine.
Well, Clio was important for Kerry. It was his first big challenge. It was his first major success, and he wanted it to work.
She was always sparkling and strong and committed to journalism. After editing Clio, she took on the editorship of the Australian Women's Weekly.
I've certainly met obstacles. I've certainly had staff who've thought, what is a woman doing here? This is a job for a bloke. What's a woman doing here? There is always a way around obstacles.
And Ita now reveals in her book that not long after she launched Clio, she had to tell Sir Frank and Kerry Packer that she was pregnant. And she writes, "They were horrified. Clio was a major investment, and in the 70s, pregnancy was seen as some kind of illness. Kerry actually rang me and said he and his father thought I hadn't read closely enough a story that was in Clio's first issue. How much do you know about contraception?" There are many funny and juicy stories in her book, from claims Network 10 planned to sack a woman because she was pregnant, and also complaints at Prudential that the men could no longer swear or tell jokes around her. But there's one lingering question Ita doesn't speak about. While the media wrongly focuses on Lattouf, there is a far more fascinating omission from Ita's book. She doesn't address the nature of her relationship with Kerry Packer. Author Gerald Stone claimed in his book, Who Killed Channel 9, that Kerry Packer fell madly in love with Buttrose in his 30s while they worked together launching Clio. Stone claimed Packer was besotted with Buttrose, writing that their relationship was a secret from Sydney society, but became a talking point in London. In his book, he wrote, during his lengthy stays in his suite at the Dorchester, a besotted Packer made no attempt to hide his feelings from Ita, from close British friends like financier Jimmy Goldsmith and John Aspinall. Sharing the heady thrill of success was a natural catalyst for a torrid office romance. Given time and public exposure, the relationship of two such strong personalities might well have developed into the kind of high-voltage match reminiscent of a Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. Now, when Stone's book was released, I asked Ita whether this was true, and she said at the time about Kerry Packer, "He's dead, we should leave him there." That was 18 years ago. She was understandably annoyed at Gerald Stone for writing about her private life. And she hasn't ever addressed the claim. And she doesn't do so in her memoir either. Now, personally, Ita was incredibly generous to me when I edited Clio magazine in 2013. She took the time to come over for tea and shared her wisdom about cover lines and editing the magazine that she founded. She also had me on her Studio 10 program, and we shared memories when Clio folded a few years later under the troubled new ownership of German media company Bauer. Ita was most recently ABC chair. She also worked for Rupert Murdoch as editor-in-chief at the Daily and Sunday Telegraph, and she writes in her book of advice Murdoch gave her about newspapers. But in my view, Ita's main achievements aren't so much in the senior editorial positions that she held, but how she's broken ground for women in so many areas of life. She removed taboos about sex, marriage, menopause, aging, and now disability. In her book, she speaks openly about the challenges of suffering from frozen gait disorder after having back surgery. She says she could walk before the surgery. Now, she jokes about having to give up wearing heels, writing, "Looking at the world through the lens of a flatties wearer is not quite the same." But then she writes very seriously about adjusting to life in a wheelchair, and she says how embarrassed she was initially. She writes, "Am I angry about what has happened to me? Yes, I am. My independence has been compromised. I never imagined my older years being a time when I'd be unable to walk properly. The one thing I loved was going walking." And she misses gardening, especially her beautiful roses and camellias. She even had to sell her country property because she couldn't look after it herself anymore. Now, as Australians, we've all followed Ita's life through its different phases, and she's always been incredibly strong, tough, and persistent. She is a legendary figure, an Australian icon, and we're with her now in this next chapter of her life.